Hey, it's David. Today I want to talk to you about some myths that float around the internet about the second generation Dukes. Most of them, I believe, are the result of misinformation that's flowed through from people who are new to the bike and don't realise that there's been two generations of bike. And this is from 2017 onwards is the second generation of bike. When a manufacturer brings a bike in, there's bound to be a few issues, a few little niggles, a few little faults that need to be fixed. And on the generation 2 bikes, they were fixed. But people see old videos, they see old advice, and they believe that it still applies. But it doesn't. On the first generation Duke, the front brake pads were a standard brake pad, which are fine, and a lot of people really like them. But if you change them over to a sintered pad, you will get better braking on the front. Some people don't like it because it does wear the front disc out faster, although that normally takes quite a long time. I like them, I fit them to all my bikes. But time and again, I see on the forums, on Facebook groups, someone coming in saying, I've just bought a bike, and somebody will always come along and go, what you need to do is to upgrade your front brake pads to sintered because the stock are rubbish. It's just not true. It's a complete myth. The fact is that the stock brake pads on these generation 2 bikes are Brembo sintered HH pads. You can change them, but you're really not going to change very much. You're going to replace one sintered pad with another sintered pad. Now, if you're racing, if you're stunting, then of course upgrades are always possible. That leads in to people saying, oh, well, the front brakes are rubbish. I can stoppy this bike perfectly happily on the stock system. On the first generation Dukes, the front brake disc was a little smaller than it is now, but KTM quickly offered an upgrade disc which was a little larger, and you had to use little spacers to move the brake caliper out. Now bear in mind, this bike runs a radial front brake, so that in itself is a good thing. The larger front disc improves the braking simply because the bigger, the wider the disc, the more leverage you get when the brake pads clamp on it. Imagine if you were trying to stop a spinning wheel by just grabbing a tiny little thing in the middle. It would be very difficult. Grab something wider, much easier. Although these have a bi-bride caliper on them, it's a nice little 4-piston caliper unit. It is not a cheap caliper unit by any stretch of imagination, and it's a lot better than you'll find fitted to many much larger bikes. And it's not a surprise because this is KTM, and KTM are performance oriented. One of the things that's very noticeable on these bikes is just how quickly the radiator fan comes in and how noisy it is. The big issue in hot climates with these bikes is the heat on your left leg, and that's largely down to the header pipe running down the left hand side of the engine. So as the fan blows air from the radiator across here, it picks up heat from the header pipe and blows that straight onto your leg, which is why on the 2020 BS6 Indian models they've actually rerouted the exhaust header pipe underneath the engine. You don't get that on the bikes they're selling here, but you do there, and that's, I believe, an attempt to actually minimise that particular issue. A comment I did see recently which amused me was commenting, well, you don't expect to see the fan come on this much, it's not a sports bike. Well, clearly they hadn't read this here. They hadn't read the message that flashes across the screen every time you turn the bike on. It says ready to race, and that's a KTM philosophy. So yes, the fan does come on and the radiator will stay cool at that point. Again, if you live somewhere hot, maybe less so. Don't be surprised if the fan is coming on because you're pushing the bike. KTM intends you to push this bike. It's why it says ready to race. It doesn't say ready to go to the shops or ready to commute to work. It says ready to race. And the philosophy of KTM is actually like a sports bike. Whilst I'm talking brakes, let's just quickly mention the rear brake. But one particular reviewer I saw recently complained that even in Supermoto mode, he wasn't able to lock the rear wheel up. Well, he's clearly got a faulty bike, and as a reviewer, you should know better than that. This bike will lock up the rear really, really easily. This is a bike that's commonly used by stunters, and they have no problem with locking up the rear wheel either. I've had a couple of conversations with people recently. One who said they didn't like the ride-by-wire system that these bikes have got. They preferred a cable throttle, so there was more feel, and that's fair enough. That's a rider preference, and there's nothing wrong with that. On these slightly earlier bikes, you have an option where you can have it in road mode, Supermoto, or turn the ABS off. In 2019, they removed the option to turn the ABS off. Now, I was chatting to a rider who told me he'd fitted a manual switch, which allowed him to just turn the ABS unit off. And he was suggesting to me that this was a great idea because it means it's permanently off, unlike at the moment with these, every time you turn the bike on you have to select the mode. And that's sort of a good thing, but I like Supermoto mode, and that brings me back to Supermoto mode. One thing I have seen often stated is that Supermoto mode just turns off the rear ABS, and this, I believe, is very far from the truth. We come back to the point that this is a ride-by-wire bike. Now, if you've ever watched videos or been involved where people are putting in new ECUs into vehicles, particularly race-oriented, then what you'll quickly realise is that they have the ability with ride-by-wire, because what ride-by-wire does, instead of having a cable directly to the throttle unit, it's all electronic. So when you turn the throttle, it sends an electronic signal to the ECU, which then manages the throttle body. That, of course, gives the ECU the ability to alter its response to that input from the throttle unit. So, for example, it's used in things like traction control and such to smooth out throttle response so that you don't get, if you make a jerky move with the throttle, the ECU will smooth it out if you've got traction control. These don't have traction control, but they do have Supermoto mode. Lots of people have reported that they find in Supermoto mode the front end of the bike will lift much easier as they're pulling away hard from traffic lights and such. If you've ever done stoppers on these bikes, you will also have noticed that there's a big difference between running in normal road mode and running in Supermoto mode. I think there's still some ABS impact on the front, but it's not like running in road mode. And I think it has also changed the mapping of the throttle to be more aggressive. So Supermoto mode, in my opinion and experience, is not just turning off the rear ABS. It really does alter the way the bike rides and handles. So there we go. Some really common myths you will see floating around on the internet about the 390 Duke and also its smaller cousins. The brakes are great. Supermoto Mode is great. There are some negative stuff floating around and being repeated by people who really should know better, although in my experience they tend to be people who are still riding the Gen 1 Dukes and I guess generally don't realise that things have changed since their bike was built and that some of the problems that they encountered with their bikes no longer apply. So thanks very much for watching and I'll catch you again soon.